Imagine a world where you don't exist. Not because you weren't born, but because the people who brought you into this world decided to hit delete. No birth certificate in the drawer. No height marks on the doorframe. No photos in the family album. You are a ghost while your heart is still beating. In February of 1957, in a desolate corner of Philadelphia known as Fox Chase, a young man was checking his traps in the undergrowth. He wasn't looking for a mystery. He was looking for muskrats. But what he found in the weeds that afternoon would become a weight that the city of Philadelphia would carry for 65 years. It started with a box. A simple, white, cardboard bassinet box from JCPenney. A box designed to cradle a newborn. But the cargo inside wasn't a beginning. It was a brutal, silent end. This is not just a story about a cold case. This is a story about the active erasure of a human being. It is about how an entire neighborhood, an entire family, and an entire system managed to look at a child's face on every newsstand and say, "I don't know him." Before we dive into the dark geometry of this 65-year silence, I need to check in with you. Where are you watching from? What time is it there, and what is the weather like today? I'm reading every single comment, and your engagement helps us bring stories like this to light. If you believe that every victim deserves a name and every truth deserves a voice, hit that subscribe button right now. Join us here at Plain Verdict. Turn on those notifications, because the case we are uncovering today is a journey into the very heart of human darkness. February 1957. The air in Philadelphia during the winter of '57 was the kind of cold that gets into your marrow. It was a season of wool coats and coal smoke. On the afternoon of February 25, the silence of a vacant lot on Susquehanna Road was broken by the footsteps of a college student. He saw the box lying in a dump heap. When he nudged the lid, he didn't see trash. He saw a pale, small shoulder. He saw a boy, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, tucked inside as if he were sleeping. But this wasn't sleep. The boy was nude. He was malnourished. But here is the detail that changed everything: he was clean. His fingernails were neatly trimmed. And his hair, his beautiful, sandy blonde hair, had been recently hacked off in jagged clumps. Some of those clumps were still clinging to his skin, static stuck to his cold flesh. When the police arrived, led by a young and determined Detective Artie Penhaligon, they expected a quick identification. After all, how do you lose a 4-year-old boy? How does a child go missing in a tight-knit, post-war American city without a single mother screaming for help? The investigators checked the missing persons reports. Nothing. They checked the orphanages. Nothing. They took the boy's fingerprints and even his footprints, a common practice for newborns in that era. They ran them against every hospital record in the tri-state area. Silence. The JCPenney box became the first lead. Detectives tracked the shipment. Only 12 of these specific bassinets had been sold in the Upper Darby area. It was a narrow margin. Orderly. Logical. They went door to door, visiting every single purchaser. 11 families showed the detectives their boxes. The 12th family claimed they had put theirs out for the trash, and a man in a green truck had hauled it away. The man in the green truck became a phantom, a shadow that the police chased for a decade. But as the weeks turned into months, the investigators realized they weren't just looking for a killer. They were looking for a ghost. The boy's face was printed on 400,000 flyers. It was wrapped in the morning milk deliveries. It hung in every precinct from Maine to Florida. The boy had been shorn like a lamb, his identity stripped away with his hair, and yet, no one claimed him. This is where the case moves from a tragedy to an anomaly. In 1957, you knew your neighbors. You knew whose laundry was on the line. You knew which child was crying 2 doors down. To have a boy simply vanish from the fabric of a neighborhood requires a collective, unspoken agreement to stay quiet. For decades, the unknown child lay in a potter's field. The detectives, including Artie, paid for his headstone out of their own pockets. It was a gesture of fatherhood for a boy who had been abandoned by his own. But then, in the 1980s, a lead emerged that would turn the stomachs of even the most hardened veterans of the force. A woman, identified only as Martha, or M, came forward with a story that sounded like a fever dream. She claimed her mother, a respected librarian, had purchased the boy from a family in 1954. She claimed the boy's name was Jonathan. According to Martha, her mother didn't want a son. She wanted a puppet. She described a life of unimaginable psychological pressure. The boy was kept in a basement. He was never allowed to speak. He was never allowed to see the sun. When he finally died, following a domestic accident involving a bathtub, Martha claimed her mother was the one who cut his hair. She was the one who drove him to the lot in Fox Chase. The police searched Martha's old home. They looked for physical evidence under the floorboards. But time is a thief. The house had been renovated. The green truck was long gone. And Martha herself struggled with mental health issues, making her testimony a legal minefield. The investigators couldn't verify her story, but they couldn't dismiss it either. This case is a labyrinth of almosts and could have beens. If you're finding this investigation as gripping as I am, take a second to hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that stories like Joseph's still matter today. 2022. The case sat in a file cabinet until the world changed. The advent of forensic genealogy meant that the dead could finally speak, even if they had no tongue. In 1998, the boy was exhumed. The city watched as his small casket was raised from the earth. They needed DNA. They needed a sequence. They managed to pull a profile from a tooth, but the technology of the late 90s wasn't enough to bridge the gap. Fast forward to 2022. Dr. Lena Wu and a team of genetic genealogists took that sequence and began the digital archaeology. They didn't look for a killer. They looked for cousins. Using public databases, they found a match. Then another. They built a tree that spanned thousands of people, stretching back to the 19th century. They narrowed it down to a single family in West Philadelphia. The Zarellis. And then, the moment that broke the silence of 65 years. They found a birth certificate. Joseph Augustus Zarelli. He was born on January 13, 1953. He had a name. He had a date of birth. He had a lineage. But the most disturbing part. The part that makes this the cold case of the century. Joseph's parents were prominent. They were still alive when the investigation began. They had other children. Joseph had siblings who grew up in the same city, went to the same schools, and lived the life he was denied. Think about that for a moment. A family living a life of normalcy while their brother lay in a nameless grave. We are about to get into the confrontation with the surviving family. If you have a theory on how a family could keep this secret for 6 decades, share it in the comments. Let's get a discussion going. The discovery of Joseph Augustus Zarelli's name wasn't a closure, it was an opening wound. It didn't just name the victim, it named the silent perpetrators. It led investigators, now spearheaded by Dr. Lena Wu, to the doors of Joseph's biological family. His siblings. Children who had lived their entire lives unaware that a brother had been erased, or perhaps, for some, living with a terrible, unspoken knowledge. This is where the true weight of hallowed ground settles in. Imagine being in your 70s, living a life of suburban comfort, reflecting on a childhood that, in your memory, was idyllic, picnics, school plays, family vacations. And then, a knock on the door. A woman holding a faded photograph of a child who has your father's eyes, your mother's chin. Drive. Lena Wu understood the delicacy of this moment. She wasn't just solving a crime, she was shattering an entire family's carefully constructed reality. She sat across from Alice, Joseph's younger sister, who was 4 years old when her brother's lifeless body was found. Alice knew nothing of a brother named Joseph. She remembered only 3 children in the family home. Lena placed the black and white photograph of Joseph on the polished coffee table. Alice gasped. There was an undeniable resemblance. But more than that, there was a visceral recognition of what wasn't. My mother told me the basement was haunted, Alice murmured, her voice thin, almost a whisper. She said if I went down there, the shadows would take me. Alice spoke of a pervasive, unspoken rule in their pristine home: certain topics were simply off limits. There was a quiet intensity when her parents spoke of their early marriage, a hurried change of subject if ever a photograph from those first few years was accidentally unearthed. Her mother had once told her, with a strange, almost vacant look in her eyes, that some things are best left buried. Alice had always assumed it was about money or a family feud. Not this. Not a life. Lena, with a compassion born from decades of working with the forgotten, gently guided Alice through the evidence. The DNA confirmed it. The birth records, pieced together from forgotten hospital files and old city registers, painted a stark picture. Joseph was born. He lived for a short time. And then, he vanished from all official records, save for that single, haunting death record of America's Unknown Child. Alice's memories, once perfectly preserved in the amber of childhood, began to crack. She recalled a baby crib that disappeared. A small, blue blanket that vanished. And then, the memory, hazy and unsettling, of her mother's strange behavior around the time the boy in the box made national headlines. Her mother, a woman known for her strict adherence to social graces, had locked herself in her room for days, emerging only to perform her duties with a forced, almost brittle cheerfulness. The family went to the shore that summer. They had ice cream on the boardwalk. And Joseph was in a box in a field. The sheer, terrifying contrast of mundane family life against the backdrop of a child's abandonment. The truth began to coalesce. Joseph wasn't a distant relative. He wasn't a long-lost cousin. He was her brother. Erased. Deleted. To Alice, it was as if her entire childhood had been built on hollowed ground. A beautiful, serene surface over an unthinkable secret. The depth of this family's silence is the most disturbing aspect of the entire case. It wasn't a fleeting moment of desperation. It was a sustained, calculated campaign of omission. A family choosing social standing over the life of a child. Considering Alice's testimony about the haunted basement, and her family's need to maintain a pristine image in the 1950s, do you think fear of social disgrace can lead people to commit unspeakable acts, or is it always a deeper, more inherent darkness? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. To truly understand the hollowed ground of Joseph's short life, we must step back into the societal currents of the 1950s. This was an era obsessed with appearances, with the nuclear family, with the idea of a perfect American dream. Deviations from this norm were not just frowned upon, they were often hidden, sometimes at a terrible cost. The Zarelli family, by all outward accounts, was striving for this ideal. They were respected. They were active in their community. They maintained a meticulous home. Joseph, it is now understood, may have presented challenges. He may have been sickly. He may have had developmental delays that, in that era, were poorly understood and often stigmatized. In a world without social services or comprehensive special needs support, a child who didn't fit the perfect mold could be seen not as a blessing but as a problem. An obstacle to a carefully constructed life. This is the chilling banality of Joseph's erasure. It wasn't the act of a monstrous stranger. It was the calculated decision of parents who prioritized their reputation and their perceived social standing over the life of their own child. They didn't want the scandal. They didn't want the judgment. They wanted to maintain the illusion of perfection. The testimony, though unverified, takes on a new, horrifying resonance here. Martha's story of a mother who purchased a child and kept him hidden, while perhaps not literally true for the Zarelli family, embodies the emotional truth of the era. The child was seen as property, to be disposed of if he didn't meet expectations. The clean body, the trimmed nails, the shorn hair, these weren't just attempts to conceal his identity, they were acts of final, chilling control. An attempt to tidy up a problem. To make him disappear not just from their lives, but from the very memory of the world. It speaks to a level of psychological detachment that remains profoundly unsettling. The act wasn't born of rage, but of a cold, sterile desire for order. The neighbors, those silent witnesses who saw nothing, heard nothing, spoke of nothing, they, too, played a part in creating this hollowed ground. In a time when everyone knew everyone's business, the absence of a child, the quiet sadness in a house, the sudden cessation of a small voice, these things would have been noticed. But the social contract of the time often dictated a polite turning of the head, a quiet deference to the sanctity of private family matters. The price of that deference, in Joseph's case, was 65 years of anonymity. The story of Joseph Augustus Zarelli is a stark reminder that some secrets are too heavy to keep, and that silence can be the loudest crime of all. His name is now known, but the full story of his final moments may forever remain in the hollowed ground of his past. In a case this cold, the smallest objects take on a religious significance. When Detective Artie Penhaligon first stood over the JCPenney box in 1957, he didn't just see a crime scene, he saw a collection of silent witnesses. But back then, the technology to make them speak didn't exist. We have to look at these items through the lens of modern criminalistics to understand just how much was missed, and how much was hidden. The boy was wrapped in a cheap, synthetic wool blend blanket. It featured a pattern of faded greens, browns, and whites. To the casual observer, it was trash. But to an investigator, a blanket is a map of a home. It carries the dander of a family dog, the fibers of a living room carpet, the unique scent of a specific brand of laundry soap. In the 50s, the police did something that would be considered a forensic sin today: they washed it. They wanted it to look presentable for the newspapers. In that one act of misguided cleanliness, they rinsed away the skin cells of the killer. They washed away the environmental DNA that could have told them if the boy lived in a house with a coal furnace or an oil heater. This is the tragedy of the hollowed ground. The evidence itself was scrubbed of its truth. Let's talk about the hair again, because this is the most disturbing detail for a reason. Forensic analysts later determined that the person who cut Joseph's hair was not a professional. The cuts were jagged, hurried, but strangely systematic. They weren't just trying to change his look, they were trying to dehumanize him. By removing his hair after his death, they were removing his vanity, his childhood, and his link to any family photos. It was a surgical act of erasure. It suggests a killer who was calm enough to perform a task over a cold body, yet desperate enough to hack away until the boy was unrecognizable. This points to a domestic perpetrator, someone who feared that the boy in the box would be recognized as the boy from 4th Street by the evening news. When you hear about a killer taking the time to wash a victim or cut their hair, does that make you feel like they had a twisted sense of care, or does it feel more like a cold, calculated cover-up? Tell me your thoughts below. I'm curious if you see care or calculation in Joseph's case. We often talk about the bystander effect, but what happened in Joseph's neighborhood was something more intentional. In 1957, neighborhoods were ecosystems. People didn't have smartphones, they had porches. They had nosy neighbors who knew exactly when the milkman arrived and exactly which children were playing in the alley. Joseph Augustus Zarelli lived for 4 years. He would have been seen. He would have been heard crying, or laughing, or coughing. Yet, when his face was plastered on every telegraph pole in the city, the silence was absolute. In post-war America, there was a dark side to the perfect family image. It was the mind your own business doctrine. If you suspected a neighbor was being too firm with their child, or if a child suddenly stopped appearing on the porch, you didn't call the authorities. You assumed the family was handling a private matter. This polite silence is what allowed the Zarellis to operate. The script of the neighborhood was written in a way that protected the parents, not the child. Joseph was a casualty of a social contract that valued the privacy of the home over the life of the inhabitant. Stories like Joseph's remind us why we can never look away. If you're finding this deep dive into the neighborhood silence thought-provoking, please share this video. The more people who understand these patterns, the fewer children fall through the cracks. When Dr. Lena Wu began the process of identifying Joseph, she wasn't just looking for a name, she was looking for a ghost in the data. Genetic genealogy is a game of triangulation. You take 2 people who share a tiny segment of DNA, maybe a second cousin in Delaware and a third cousin in Ohio, and you find the ancestor they have in common. But in Joseph's case, the tree was hollowed out. Many of his direct relatives had died childless, or their records had been lost in the 1910s and 20s. Lena had to go back to the 1800s, to an immigrant family arriving in Philadelphia, and then build the tree forward to the 1950s. The most chilling moment for the forensic team was finding the birth record of Joseph. It wasn't in a family Bible. It wasn't in a box of memories. It was in a digitized city archive that had been mislabeled. Joseph had been born in a hospital, he had a social security number assigned, and then, the paper trail went dead. No school registration. No vaccination records. No census entry for 1960. It was as if the family had physically reached into the machinery of the state and pulled him out of the gears. This wasn't a child who wandered off. This was a child who was systematically uninstalled from reality. Joseph Augustus Zarelli is no longer the boy in the box. He is a son of Philadelphia. He is a brother. He is a person. But the most disturbing part of this cold case isn't that it was solved. it's that it had to be solved by computers 65 years later because the people who knew him chose to stay silent until they went to their own graves. The hallowed ground isn't just the lot in Fox Chase. It's the legacy of a family that chose a lie over a boy. It's the legacy of a neighborhood that chose politeness over a life. To understand why Joseph's family, and perhaps his community, chose to let him become a ghost, we have to talk about the terrifying power of 1950s social stigma. Today, we live in an era of oversharing. In 1953, the plain verdict was that your reputation was your only currency. If you lost it, you lost everything. Joseph was born into a Philadelphia that was deeply religious, socially conservative, and obsessed with the concept of the unblemished lineage. In this world, an illegitimate child or a child with a defect wasn't seen as a tragedy to be supported, it was seen as a moral failure of the parents. During our research into the Zarelli family tree, a pattern began to emerge. The mid-century was the era of hidden rooms. Thousands of children across the United States were kept in attics or back bedrooms because they didn't fit the post-war image of the robust, healthy American family. If Joseph was sickly, if he suffered from a developmental delay, or if he was the product of a relationship that the family wanted to hide, the solution of the time was erasure. The horror of the hallowed ground is that the family likely felt they were being responsible by getting rid of the problem. In their twisted logic, a dead child in a field was better than a living shame in the parlor. This is the dark underbelly of the greatest generation, a period where saving face was often valued more than saving a life. While the social history gives us the why, the laboratory gives us the who. The journey of Joseph's DNA is a miracle of modern science. When he was exhumed in the late 90s, the forensic team wasn't looking for a miracle, they were looking for a sequence. DNA is fragile. It hates heat, it hates moisture, and it hates time. Joseph had been buried in the damp soil of Philadelphia for decades. Most of his soft tissue was gone, leaving only the hollowed ground of his skeletal remains. The team targeted a single tooth, the hardest, most protected part of the human body. Inside the pulp of that tooth was a microscopic time capsule. But the DNA was fragmented. Imagine a book that has been shredded into a billion pieces. In the 1950s, we couldn't even read a single letter. In the 90s, we could read a few words. But by 2022, we could rebuild the entire library. Drive. Lena Wu didn't just find a match, she built a bridge of cousins. She used a technique called long-range kinship testing. Phase 1. Upload the profile to databases like GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. Phase 2. Identify, segment matches. These are people who share small chunks of the 22 pairs of chromosomes. Phase 3. The sliding scale. If a stranger shares 200 centimorgans of DNA with the boy in the box, they are likely a second or third cousin. Lena's team spent months tracing these centimorgans through census records, wedding announcements, and funeral programs. They were looking for a specific intersection, a family in West Philadelphia that was in the right place, at the right time. With a missing branch in their tree. When the lines finally crossed at the Zarelli name, the lab went silent. It wasn't just a match. It was a mirror. The DNA didn't just tell them who Joseph was, it told them exactly who had left him in that field. We often ask if justice delayed is justice denied. In the case of Joseph Augustus Zarelli, the answer is a complicated one. The parents are gone. They never spent a night in a cell. They never had to explain to a jury why their son was in a JCPenney box while they were eating dinner. But the plain verdict is this: the truth has a way of outliving the liar. The Zarelli family spent 65 years building a wall of silence, but they forgot that they left a piece of themselves in that box. Joseph's DNA was the one thing they couldn't scrub away. Today, people visit Joseph's grave. They leave toys. They leave flowers. They leave the childhood items he never got to touch. The hallowed ground has been filled with the collective memory of a city that refused to forget him. We've spent a lot of time today in the shadows of the past. If you've stayed with us until this moment, you're part of the reason Joseph finally has his name back. Before you click away, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Plain Verdict. We're dedicated to bringing the truth to the light, no matter how deep it's been buried. In true crime, we often focus on the killer and the victim. But there is a third pillar in the most disturbing cold cases: the people who cannot let go. For Detective Artie Penhaligon and his colleagues in the Philadelphia Police Department, Joseph wasn't just a file. He became a silent member of their own families. Artie spent his weekends driving to the potter's field. He wasn't on the clock. He wasn't getting overtime. He was simply a man who couldn't accept that a child could be discarded like yesterday's news. He spent his own money to ensure the boy had a headstone. He became a surrogate father to a child he only ever knew as a body in a box. Imagine the psychological weight of looking at every 4-year-old boy you pass on the street and wondering, is that his brother? Could that be his cousin? Artie and his partner spent years following sightings that led nowhere. They interviewed hundreds of people who claimed to have seen a boy in a green truck, or a child crying in a basement. This is the hallowed ground of the investigator's mind. It's the space where logic meets obsession. The detectives were working in an era before computers, before databases, before even the basic understanding of child psychology we have today. They were fighting a war with primitive tools, fueled only by a sense of moral outrage. Artie Penhaligon never gave up, even when the world told him the trail was dead. If you believe in that kind of relentless pursuit of justice, hit the like button. It's a small gesture, but it honors the people who refuse to let these victims be forgotten. We have to ask the hard question: how did the system fail Joseph Augustus Zarelli so completely? In 1957, the police were respected, the church was the center of life, and the government was seen as a protector. Yet, not one of these institutions caught the erasure of a child. Joseph was born in a hospital. There was a record of his birth. But in the 1950s, hospital records weren't centralized. There was no red flag that went up when a child missed their 4-year checkup. There was no digital system to alert social services if a child never registered for kindergarten. The Zarelli family navigated these gaps with surgical precision. They lived in the hollow spaces of the law. By simply not enrolling him in school and keeping him away from public spaces, they made him invisible to the state. The hallowed ground was the very system that was supposed to keep him safe. In the end, the truth didn't come from a confession. It didn't come from a deathbed apology. It came from the very thing that makes us human, our code. Joseph's DNA was a message sent across 65 years, a message that said, I was here. I existed. I am someone. The resolution of this case is the ultimate, plain verdict. It tells us that no matter how much you scrub the floor, no matter how many times you cut the hair, and no matter how deep you bury the box, you cannot delete the truth. The hallowed ground has finally been filled. Joseph Augustus Zarelli is home. Now that Joseph finally has his name, do you feel a sense of peace, or does the fact that his parents never faced a trial leave you feeling like justice was only half served? I want to hear your final thoughts on this. Is a name enough? Let's discuss it in the comments. Every time we share a story like this, we are lighting a candle in a very dark room. Joseph's story is the most disturbing cold case of the century because it shows us how easily a life can be forgotten if we don't pay attention. But it also shows us that we have the power to remember. Thank you for staying with us through this deep dive into the life and silence of Joseph Augustus Zarelli. This has been one of the most intense investigations we've ever covered on Plain Verdict. If you haven't already, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. We have many more truths to uncover, and we can't do it without you. Share this video, keep the conversation going, and always keep seeking the truth. I'll see you in the next one.